At 5:42 a.m. on May 17, 1943, at Bassingbourn Airfield in Cambridgeshire, England, Captain Robert Morgan stood beneath the nose of a B-17 Flying Fortress and watched the ground crew paint one final bomb symbol on the fuselage. 24 yellow bombs already marked the aluminum skin. This 25th would be painted in red, because after this mission, if they survived it, the Memphis Belle and her crew would go home. They would be the first heavy bomber crew in the 8th Air Force to complete 25 missions over Nazi-occupied Europe and live to tell about it. The odds said they wouldn't make it. Statistics compiled by 8th Air Force headquarters showed that the average bomber crew had less than 1 in 4 chance of surviving a full tour. 25 missions. That was the magic number, the threshold between combat duty and home. But most crews never reached it. They died over France, over Belgium, over Germany, shot down by fighters, destroyed by flak, crippled by mechanical failure, and left to fall from 25,000 feet with nowhere to land but enemy territory or the North Sea. Morgan knew the numbers. Every pilot knew them. But standing there in the pre-dawn darkness, watching his crew chief paint that final symbol, he allowed himself something he hadn't permitted in months. Hope. The Memphis Belle had earned her name from Morgan's sweetheart back in Memphis, Tennessee, Margaret Polk. Her face was painted on the nose of the aircraft, rendered in the classic pin-up style that decorated hundreds of American bombers. But unlike most of those bombers, the Belle had survived. Through flak storms over Wilhelmshaven, through fighter attacks over Lorient, through 100 moments when mathematics said she should have exploded, fallen, burned. And now, one mission remained. May 1943. The air war over Europe was in its most brutal phase. The Allied strategic bombing campaign had been underway for nearly a year, and the cost was staggering. Every week, dozens of bombers failed to return. Every week, hundreds of young men died in the frozen air above Germany. The theory was simple: destroy German industrial capacity through precision daylight bombing. The reality was carnage. The B-17 Flying Fortress was designed to fight its way to the target and back without fighter escort. 4 turrets, 13.50 caliber machine guns, armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks. The nickname Flying Fortress wasn't marketing, it was doctrine. The belief that massed formations of heavily armed bombers could defend themselves against enemy fighters through concentrated firepower. That doctrine was being tested to destruction every day over Europe. The Luftwaffe had learned to exploit every weakness in the B-17's defensive coverage. Head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high, where only the limited forward guns could engage. Coordinated attacks from multiple angles that overwhelmed the gunners. Rocket-firing fighters that stood off beyond machine gun range and fired into the formations. And the flak. German 88mm anti-aircraft guns that could reach 30,000 feet and fill entire cubic miles of sky with exploding steel. A single flak burst could shred a bomber's control surfaces. A direct hit could detonate the bomb load and vaporize the aircraft in a millisecond. Flying through a flak barrage meant holding formation, maintaining speed, staying on the bomb run, while the sky turned into a killing zone of shrapnel and concussion. Morgan's crew had survived all of it. 10 men who had learned to function as a single organism. The pilot and co-pilot, flying in perfect coordination during combat maneuvers. The navigator and bombardier, guiding the aircraft to the target through clouds, flak, and chaos. The engineer monitoring 4 engines that had to keep running for 8, 9, 10 hours without failure. The radio operator maintaining contact with the formation and base, and the gunners. 5 men in isolated positions throughout the aircraft, watching the sky for the black dots that meant fighters inbound. They had names. First Lieutenant James Verinis, co-pilot. Captain Vincent Evans, navigator. Captain Charles Layton, bombardier. Master Sergeant Robert Hanson, radio operator. Staff Sergeant Cecil Scott, engineer and top turret gunner. Staff Sergeant Casimir Nastel, ball turret gunner. Staff Sergeant Clarence Winchell, right waist gunner. Staff Sergeant John Quinlan, left waist gunner. Staff Sergeant Harold Locke, tail gunner. 10 men who had seen 24 missions, who had watched other crews disappear, who had flown through formations that left with 36 bombers and returned with 18, who had seen friends burn, fall, die, and who now faced one final roll of the dice. The target for May 17th was Kiel, Germany, a submarine. Construction facility on the Baltic coast. Strategic importance, critical. Distance from England, 450 miles each way. Expected fighter opposition, heavy. Expected flak concentration, intense. Probability of losses. Command estimated 10 to 15% of the attacking force would not return. The mission briefing took place at 0400 hours. Morgan and his crew sat in a crowded room with 300 other men, all watching as the intelligence officer pulled back a curtain to reveal a map with a red line stretching from England across the North Sea into northern Germany. The collective groan was audible. Kiel. Deep penetration. Maximum exposure. The intelligence officer outlined the tactical situation. Kiel's submarine yards had produced 27 U-boats in the previous 6 months. Those submarines were destroying Allied shipping in the North Atlantic at rates that threatened to cut supply lines to Britain. Destroying the construction facilities wasn't just a strategic objective, it was a survival necessity. But the Germans knew that. Kiel was defended by more than 200 anti-aircraft guns and 3 fighter wings stationed within 30 minutes flying time. The operations officer outlined the formation. 306 bombers divided into multiple combat boxes, staggered altitudes, overlapping defensive fire. The Memphis Belle would fly in the low squadron of the lead group. Position, exposed, but also visible. If they were going to complete this mission and go home, the brass wanted documentation. There would be a film crew aboard, combat cameramen who would record the entire mission. Because if Morgan and his crew survived this, they would become symbols, proof that the strategic bombing campaign could work, evidence that men could beat the odds. Morgan listened to all of it with the calm that came from experience. He had heard 24 mission briefings before this one. They all sounded the same. Numbers, distances, objectives, threats. What they never included was the reality of combat. The way the aircraft shook when flak burst nearby. The smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid and fear. The sound of machine guns firing for minutes at a time until the barrels glowed red. The cold that penetrated every layer of clothing at 25,000 feet. The way time distorted during combat, seconds stretching into hours, while your hands moved in automatic patterns that training had burned into muscle memory. At 5:15, Morgan and his crew walked to the Belle. Ground crews had been working on her all night. 4 Wright R1 820. Cyclone engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, had been inspected, tested, and certified. Fuel tanks held 2,520 gallons of 100-octane aviation gasoline. Bomb bay carried 12 500-pound high-explosive bombs. Ammunition bins held 6,500 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. Oxygen system checked and pressurized. Every system verified, because one mechanical failure at the wrong moment meant death. The crew performed their pre-flight rituals. Scott climbed into the top turret and cycled it through its full range of motion. Nastel squeezed into the ball turret suspended beneath the fuselage, the most claustrophobic and vulnerable position on the aircraft. The waist gunners loaded their weapons and cleared jams. Locke made his way to the tail position, isolated and alone at the very back of the aircraft, where he would spend the entire mission watching for fighters approaching from behind. Morgan and Varines went through the cockpit checklist. Battery switches on, fuel selector valves checked, trim tabs neutral, flaps up. Each item verified, confirmed, double-checked.
because shortcuts killed, complacency killed, assumptions killed. At 5:41, Morgan started engine number 3. The right cyclone coughed, caught, roared to life. Then engine 4, then 1, then 2. The noise was immense. 300 bombers spread across Bassingbourn Airfield. 1,200 engines, nearly 1.5 million horsepower turning aluminum propellers that bit into the English morning air. At 6:15, the Memphis Belle began to taxi. 30 tons of aircraft, fuel, bombs, ammunition, and men rolling toward the runway. Around them, dozens of other bombers moved in the same direction, a slow parade of death machines heading toward their formation positions. Morgan advanced the throttles. The Belle accelerated down the runway. The tail wheel lifted. The main gear stayed on the concrete. 70 miles per hour, 80, 90. At 105 miles per hour, Morgan eased back on the yoke, and the Memphis Belle climbed into the sky for the 25th and final time. The formation took 40 minutes to assemble. 306 bombers circling over England, gradually organizing into combat boxes. Each box consisted of 18 to 21 aircraft, flying in precise positions relative to each other. The geometry wasn't arbitrary. It was designed to create overlapping fields of defensive fire. Any fighter attacking the formation would face guns from multiple bombers simultaneously. But the geometry also created vulnerability. Maintaining formation required discipline. Aircraft couldn't deviate to avoid flak, couldn't maneuver independently during fighter attacks. The pilots had to hold position no matter what happened around them. It was a doctrine that sacrificed individual survival for collective defense. And on days when the Luftwaffe brought overwhelming force, that doctrine meant entire formations could be slaughtered before reaching the target. At 7:23, the formation turned east and headed toward the North Sea. Behind them, England disappeared into the morning haze. Ahead, nothing but water and then enemy territory. The point of no return had been passed the moment they left the English coast. There were no alternates, no emergency fields. Either they completed the mission and returned to England, or they didn't come back at all. The North Sea crossing took 90 minutes. The bombers flew at 25,000 feet, where the temperature was 40 degrees below zero, and the air was so thin that without oxygen, a man would lose consciousness in seconds. Inside the aircraft, the crew wore electrically heated suits that barely kept hypothermia at bay. Frost formed on every metal surface. Breath froze instantly in the air. At 8:47, the navigator's voice came through the intercom. "Coast ahead. Denmark in 3 minutes." Morgan's hands tightened on the yoke. From this point forward, they were in range of German radar. Fighter bases across northern Germany would be receiving updates on the formation's course and altitude. Luftwaffe pilots would be running to their aircraft. Flak batteries would be calculating firing solutions. The Danish coast appeared below, a thin line of land separating sea from continent, and beyond it, Germany. At 9:04, the first fighters appeared. Focke-Wulf 190s, fast, heavily armed, and flown by pilots who had been killing American bombers for months. They approached from the front, slightly above the formation. Head-on attacks, the most dangerous because they exploited the B-17's weakest defensive sector. The intercom erupted with call-outs. "Fighters, 12 o'clock high. 2 more, 11 o'clock level. 3 breaking left, coming around for another pass." The forward guns opened fire. The sound inside the aircraft was deafening, even through flight helmets. The .50 caliber machine guns fired 800 rounds per minute, but in combat, gunners fired in short bursts to conserve ammunition and prevent barrel overheating. 2-second bursts, 6-round bursts, tracers arcing out into the sky, trying to lead the fighters by the right amount to intersect their flight path. The Focke-Wulfs flashed past at a closing speed of 500 miles per hour. Their 20mm cannons fired. Morgan saw the muzzle flashes, then the sky around the Belle filled with tracer rounds and cannon shells. Something hit the left wing.
Something else punched through the nose section. The aircraft shuddered, but kept flying. Nastel in the ball turret called out more fighters coming from below. Locke in the tail reported 3 more approaching from 6 o'clock level. The gunners tracked, fired, tracked again. Empty shell casings piled up in the waist section. The air filled with gun smoke and the smell of burnt powder. One of the Focke-Wulfs exploded. A lucky hit in the fuel tank or ammunition storage. The fighter disintegrated in a ball of fire and wreckage. The German pilot never had time to bail out. One moment he was attacking. The next moment he was vapor. The fighter attacks continued for 18 minutes. Wave after wave of Luftwaffe aircraft diving into the formation, firing, breaking away, regrouping for another pass. The bombers maintained formation and returned fire. Aircraft on both sides fell. A B-17 3 positions behind the bell took a direct hit in the bomb bay. The entire aircraft disappeared in a massive explosion that left nothing but smoke and falling debris. 21 bombers had started the mission in that particular combat box. 17 remained. At 9:22, the fighters broke off. They had expended their ammunition or reached their fuel limits. But the respite was temporary. Another fighter group would intercept the formation closer to the target. Morgan checked his instruments. All 4 engines running normally. Fuel consumption within expected parameters. No major damage. The hit on the left wing had torn a hole in the aluminum skin, but hadn't struck anything critical. The round that came through the nose had missed Evans and Leighton by inches and exited through the roof without hitting anyone. They had been lucky, but luck was a finite resource. At 9:47, the navigator announced they were 20 minutes from the target. That meant 20 minutes from the flak zone. German anti-aircraft. Defenses around Kiel included more than 200 guns positioned in concentric rings around the submarine yards. The outer ring would open fire when the formation came within range. Then the middle ring. Then the inner ring, where the concentration was so intense that survival became purely statistical. The formation tightened. Any aircraft struggling with damage or engine problems had to keep up or fall behind and face fighters alone. The bell maintained her position. Morgan's hands on the yoke. Verini's monitoring the engines. Scott in the top turret scanning for fighters. Every man at his station, waiting for what came next. At 10:03, the flak began. The first bursts were orange and black flowers blooming in the sky ahead of the formation. German 88mm guns firing in synchronized barrages. Each shell climbed to a preset altitude and detonated, sending thousands of steel fragments in all directions. The gunners on the ground couldn't see individual aircraft. They fired calculated patterns designed to fill volumes of sky with shrapnel. The bombers had to fly through those volumes to reach the target. Morgan held the bell steady. The explosions grew closer. One burst directly ahead, 2 more to the left, another so close that the concussion rocked the aircraft. The sound was like thunder compressed into instants. Each explosion generated a pressure wave that could be felt through the airframe. Shrapnel hit the bell. Dozens of pieces, small fragments that punched holes in the fuselage, larger pieces that tore through control surfaces. One chunk of steel shattered the plexiglass in the bombardier's position. Leighton felt the air rush past his face, but kept his eyes on the bomb site. The flak intensified. The formation was fully inside the defensive zone now. The sky ahead was solid black smoke from explosions. Morgan flew into it. There was no other choice. The bomb run had begun. From this point until bombs away, the aircraft belonged to the bombardier. Morgan's job was to hold the heading and altitude that Leighton called for. No evasive action, no deviation, just straight and level flight through a storm of high explosives. Leighton's voice on the intercom, "Steady, hold this altitude, left 2 degrees, hold it, hold it." The bell flew through hell. All around them, bombers were hit. One aircraft ahead suddenly nosed over and went into a vertical dive, trailing smoke. Another exploded. A third fell out of formation with 2 engines on fire. The surviving bombers closed the gaps and continued toward the target. At 10:11, Layton said the words every crew waited for. "Bombs away!" The Memphis Belle lurched upward as 6,000 pounds of high explosive dropped from the bomb bay. Morgan felt the aircraft respond, suddenly lighter, more responsive. But they weren't done. The bomb run required the formation to maintain course for another 20 seconds, while cameras documented the impact points. 20 seconds in the flak with empty bomb bays and no defensive reason to stay. Those 20 seconds lasted forever. Flak burst continuously around the Belle. Something hit the No. 2 engine. The cylinder head temperature spiked. Morgan reduced power to that engine and increased power to the others to maintain airspeed. The aircraft shook. Alarms sounded. And then, finally, the formation leader turned away from the target and the flak lessened. But they were 450 miles from England, with battle damage, with one engine running rough, with German fighters regrouping somewhere ahead to intercept the formation on its return journey. The flight back was a nightmare of attrition. Fighters hit them over the Danish coast again. The depleted formations had less defensive firepower. More aircraft were lost. The Belle's gunners expended the last of their ammunition. When a Focke-Wulf made a final pass at 11:34, Quinlan in the left waist position fired his last burst, and then had nothing left but the empty gun and the hope that the German pilot wouldn't realize they were defenseless. The pilot didn't come back. Maybe he was out of ammunition too. Maybe he'd seen enough for one day. Maybe he was dead. At 12:17, the formation crossed the English coast. Behind them, Germany. Ahead, home. The No. 2 engine was overheating badly now. Morgan shut it down completely and feathered the propeller. The Belle flew on 3 engines, slower, heavier, but flying. At 13:03, Bassingbourn Airfield appeared ahead. Morgan called the tower and received clearance to land. He configured the aircraft for approach. Flaps down, landing gear extended. The Belle descended toward the runway on 3 engines, battered, shot full of holes, leaking hydraulic fluid, but intact. At 13:11, the wheels touched concrete. The Memphis Belle rolled to a stop. Morgan shut. Down the remaining engines. The sudden silence was overwhelming after 9 hours of constant noise. The ground crew swarmed the aircraft, counting the holes. There were 87. Any one of them could have been fatal if it had hit 6 inches in a different direction. Fuel tanks, control lines, oxygen bottles, crew members. 87 moments when physics and geometry aligned to miss something critical. Morgan climbed out of the cockpit. His legs were numb from sitting for 9 hours. His hands shook from adrenaline and exhaustion. He walked around the Belle, touching the fuselage, seeing the damage. Behind him, his crew emerged from the aircraft. 10 men who had completed 25 missions, who had beaten odds that said they should be dead, who had survived long enough to go home. Captain Robert Morgan and the crew of the Memphis Belle were officially relieved from combat duty that afternoon. They had completed their tour. They were going home to the United States to train new crews and participate in war bond tours. They would become celebrities, symbols of American determination, proof that the bombing campaign could work. But standing there on the tarmac at Bassingbourn, watching ground crews repair the Belle, Morgan wasn't thinking about celebrity or symbols. He was thinking about the crews that didn't come back, the B-17 that exploded during the fighter attack, the bomber that nosed over during the flak barrage, the aircraft that fell out of formation with engines burning. 306 bombers had taken off that morning. 283 returned. 23 aircraft lost. 230 men dead or missing. For one submarine facility in Kiel that might or might not be significantly damaged. That was the mathematics of strategic bombing. Numbers large enough to seem abstract until you knew the names, until you remembered faces, until you carried the weight of survival when so many others didn't. The Memphis Belle was retired from combat operations after that final mission. The aircraft was sent back to the United States for a war bond tour. The crew traveled the country, giving speeches, meeting crowds, selling the idea that the war could be won through air power and determination. The Belle herself was eventually donated to the city of Memphis after the war. For decades, she sat outside, exposed to weather, slowly deteriorating. In 2005, a restoration project began. It took 13 years of meticulous work to return the aircraft to her 1943 configuration. In 2018, the restored Memphis Belle went on permanent display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. But restoration can only preserve the aircraft. It can't restore the men who flew her. Of the original crew, most lived long lives after the war. Morgan died in 2004 at age 85. The others passed in subsequent years. They carried their memories privately, the missions they flew, the friends they lost, the decisions they made in moments when there was no time for hesitation. The Memphis Belle's final mission wasn't special because of what was accomplished over Kiel. It was special because 10 men survived long enough to come home, because probability said they should have died like thousands of others, but they didn't, because sometimes in war, mathematics allows exceptions, and because that exception, that survival, became a story that could be told, a story that said survival was possible, that courage could be rewarded, that men could face impossible odds and live to remember it. But for every Memphis Belle that came home, dozens of others didn't. For every crew that completed 25 missions, 20 others died before reaching 10. The Belle's story is inspiring because it's true, but it's also dangerous because it's exceptional. Most bomber crews didn't beat the odds. Most aircraft didn't survive. Most men died far from home in the frozen sky over Europe, and their stories ended with a telegram to families who would never see them again. The Memphis Belle survived. Her crew survived, and their survival mattered because it proved that survival was possible. But it also mattered as a reminder of all those who tried just as hard, fought just as bravely, and fell anyway. War doesn't care about courage. It doesn't reward determination. It runs on mathematics and probability, and the intersection of metal and flesh at high velocity. Sometimes the math allows survival. Mostly, it doesn't. The Memphis Belle flew her final mission on May 17th, 1943. She landed safely. Her crew went home. And somewhere over Kiel that day, other crews didn't. Their stories ended in fire or water or German prison camps. Their names are on memorials. Their faces are in old photographs that fewer people look at each year. They flew the same missions, faced the same dangers, made the same choices, but the mathematics of survival fell differently for them. The Memphis Belle's story is worth telling because it happened, because 10 men earned the right to go home. But it's also worth remembering that their survival was the exception that proved the terrible rule of strategic bombing in 1943. Most didn't make it home. The Belle did, and that difference is what makes her story both inspiring and heartbreaking at the same time.